medieval church, a classic feature amongst the quintessential English countryside. If you've been a follower of this channel for a while now, you'll know that I've done quite a few videos on the subject of churches, abbeys, friaries, cathedrals and medieval religion in general. In today's video, I want to tell you all about the different parts of a typical medieval church in England, and how a humble Norman chapel like this can evolve into a giant of masonry such as this. So come with me as we explore the evolution of the medieval English church. Firstly, we'll begin by giving a brief overview of what a church, in its most basic form, actually is. In essence, a church is a shrine. Shrines can take many forms: a temple, a standing stone, a henge, but after the Romans adopted Christianity following the Edict of Milan, issued by Emperor Constantine in 313 AD, Christianity was granted legal status as a religion. And by the 5th century AD, this was the new mainstream religion in Roman England. Unlike the grand temples dedicated to the old Roman pagan gods such as Jupiter or Mars, these new shrines took a much more humble approach. Possibly due to the fact that the Roman government began to allow Christians to practice their faith, but these Christian followers were still a very small minority of the Roman society's population in any given settlement, and therefore would only require, or afford, the construction of very small single-room buildings to practice their faith. When the Roman Empire fell, Britain was essentially cut off from mainland Europe as the fall of the empire caused the breakdown of many reliable trade routes and military backup. With the various Saxon raids and domestic settlements around the British coast, the surviving Romano-Britannic population were largely left to fend for themselves. This caused a significant setback in the advancement of Christianity, as these new Saxon settlers were pagan and, in the decades that followed, Britain gradually fell back into paganism once more. Say what you like about paganism, but the unfortunate fact is that paganism just wasn't good for trade, education and self-betterment. Christianity brought enlightenment to a lot of people across Britain, and, with the help of St. Patrick and various other missionaries, Christianity began to take hold once more, but this time on a larger scale. All throughout Britain, chapels were being built all over the landscape. These were the first formal pilgrimage sites for Christians in England. A chapel is a simple four-walled single-room building, often as basic as can be, with a door for entrance. The main, and usually only, piece of furniture inside these chapels was the altar. Essentially an offering table. It should be said, however, that altars were not exclusively a Christian object. They had been used by almost all mainstream religions, including the ancient Neolithic henge sites where they played an extremely important spiritual role. Neolithic altars were usually a large tree stump, often turned upside down in a spiritual belief that the tree would grow again in the underworld. The roots acting as flourishing branches as the tree would once again blossom in this new alternative universe that the Neolithic worshippers believed in. An early Christian altar was, instead, generally a stone slab supported on two stone bricks and generally featured a crude wooden cross as a centrepiece. The earliest known English church is St Martin's just outside Canterbury in Kent, with Roman brick within its walls dating it to at least 580 AD. Although it is not confirmed whether the Roman brick was installed here for the purpose of the building of the Christian church, or was from an earlier building which was then repurposed for the construction of the church instead. Over in Norfolk we see a similar story where elements of St Theobald's church near Coltishall has likely remnants of Roman brick and tile within its construction, but in this case we know that the Roman construction material was repurposed. One of the first additions we see to a chapel is the chancel. This was a secondary room which split the chapel in two. The chancel would be situated on the eastern end of the chapel and acted as a room specifically to house the altar. As such, a typical chancel would be incredibly small, some being only just larger than the altar itself. The ruins of Mel's Chapel in Suffolk gives us an excellent example of a typical chancel dating to the early 12th century. This chapel of St Margaret was built shortly after the Norman invasion and is one of a kind in East Anglia, due to the fact that once built it was never modified, expanded, adapted nor modernised throughout the entirety of its 400 years of service as a functional Christian church. This gives us a valuable insight into the dimensions of a typical early place of worship in rural areas across medieval England. It certainly is interesting to compare the chancel of Mel's Chapel to that of a grand cathedral such as St Albans, and see how centuries of prosperity, riches and culture has modified a place of worship, considering that St Albans Cathedral most likely started life off as a humble chapel similar to St Margaret's. Over time, the semicircular chancel rooms were usually modified into larger, square buildings. With the construction of the chancel, a name must now be given to the main original room inside the chapel. This became known as the nave. The nave was the area where worshippers would stand, not sit, and listen to the priest give sermons from the altar. Church pews wouldn't become a thing until several hundred years later. A church's nave was the most common component to be extended over time. As settlements expanded, a local parish church would surely need to accommodate for a larger audience. Naves could be expanded both lengthways and sideways. The construction of aisles on either side of the nave would help make the church larger but also provide alternative walkways rather than use the central aisle in the middle of the nave. The sides of the walls were punched through, then replaced with ornate arches atop sturdy columns, and large windows were made in the new walls which allowed for light to fill the church. The doorway connecting to the nave and the chancel would also be given a large archway, known rather aptly as the chancel arch. The main public entrance would be situated on the west end of the nave, at the opposite side of the altar. The west end outside wall of the church would typically be extensively ornate, featuring beautiful masonry called a facade, complete with blind arcading, statuettes of saints on top of pedestals within alcoves within the wall, and the centrepiece would often be the largest window in the church. The west end of Castle Priory in Norfolk features one of the most incredible west end facades in all of England. The second earliest feature in a church, and one of the most recognisable, would have probably been the tower. Most Saxon towers that survive today were built in around the 11th century, but we do not know when the earliest church tower was built. A common misconception is that you can always identify a Saxon church from a Norman church from the round tower. However, unfortunately this is false, as there are many examples of Norman round towers also built around the 11th and 12th century. Indeed, a round tower was mainly built as a result of a construction material available in the local area. Square towers typically needed large stones cut into shape to form the corners, which gave the structure more strength and stability. Some areas, such as East Anglia, have no local stone resources capable of producing these large cornerstones, so rely instead on flint. The most structurally stable option for a tower using flint is a circular design, which is why round towers are particularly common within East Anglia. If you go to Great Yarmouth or Norwich, you'll see that the city walls there that survive are round towers and also made of flint. The predecessor of the church tower was a much more simple feature known as a bellcote. This was a triangular arch which housed a bell. The priest would peal the bell to notify the locals that it's time to congregate to the church for worship. As the Catholic Church grew bigger and more influential, vast sums of money were spent all across Britain to upgrade these bellcotes, providing a tower called a belfry to house the bells, allowing the church bells to be suspended higher up and letting the sound ring over the countryside far and wide. By the 11th century, the Saxons were beginning to develop these belfry towers into grand architectural statements, complete with splendourous arches, blind arcading and bevelled buttresses. Coincidentally, some of these Saxon church towers were rather similar to the later stone keeps that the Normans built all throughout England to keep the Saxons in check under the new feudal system. In cathedrals, priories and abbeys, the main belfry tower would be situated in the centre of the church, with the nave connected to the western side of the tower and the chancel to the eastern side. This central tower would become known as the steeple tower. As early as the 12th century, belfry towers also sometimes feature spires. Spires are essentially high roofs, but began to become more exaggerated with the intent to show off both architectural prowess, as well as proving one's dedication of faith to God, essentially attempting to build everything bigger and better. Spires often caused headaches for medieval architects, as they were difficult structures to build and were victims to extreme weather. Time and time again, ruthless storms would cause spires to fall down. They acted as prime targets for lightning strikes, which proved incredibly dangerous when spires were commonly built of wood. As is apparent in 1463, when Norwich Cathedral's wooden spire was struck by lightning and fell down onto the nave roof, which was also made of wood. The subsequent fire caused extensive damage to the cathedral, which resulted in the construction of a new stone spire and vaulted nave ceiling in the 1480s. A common feature on more grander medieval churches is the porch. Similar to that of domestic dwellings, the porch functioned as a sheltered main entrance to the church, built into the side of the nave. Churches would sometimes feature a single porch on one side of the church, or sometimes on both sides, allowing the church to remain somewhat symmetrical. Cathedrals, priories and abbeys don't typically feature porches as such, since the main entrance was situated within the west end wall of the nave, but porches allowed a parish church to look more ornate, and capture some of the grandeur of those awe-inspiring West End facades, but on a smaller scale. However, cathedrals, priories and abbeys do feature something similar. Although they certainly look much like the porches on a church, just on a larger scale, these are named transepts. These are additional buildings attached to the north and south sides of the central steeple tower of grand churches like cathedrals, and as such they are notably named the North Transept and the South Transept. These originally housed the auxiliary altars, but if you visit them today, you'll tend to find that the altar has subsequently been replaced by tombs, often that of bishops who have served in the cathedral during their lifetime. Transepts were often very ornate, sometimes featuring large stained glass windows, and are the most common part of a cathedral to see the beautiful rose or wheel windows. The transepts would open up into the main cathedral via the transept arch, to which would lead into the central crossing, the area directly underneath the steeple tower. If you look up from the central crossing, you will often see a small circular hole in the ceiling of the tower above you. This is where medieval construction workers would hoist building materials up into the tower via a system of ropes when working on the higher levels of the cathedral. The ceiling of the central crossing was often also the most decorative, featuring extremely elaborate designs in both painting and masonry. Rood screens were commonly placed near the central crossing, usually at the entrance to the chancel. Rood screens took many forms, most commonly made from wood, stone or alabaster. The rood is the name given to the cross erected at the entry of the chancel, most commonly featuring figures such as the Virgin Mary or St. John. Wooden rood galleries were installed to support the cross, which again often depicted figures of saints, this time painted into the wooden panels. The Grand Gothic Church of Eye in Suffolk features a gorgeous example of a rood gallery. Over time, and at the cost of great expense, rood galleries were upgraded to rood screens in the grander cathedrals, effectively a wall covered in religious carvings, similar in grandeur to the West End wall. In some larger churches, again such as cathedrals, an additional room is added between the nave and the central crossing. This is called the choir. As the name suggests, the choir was the area where services were sung. A notable feature of the choir are the wooden benches, often adorned in ornate carvings. These were commonly installed after the 16th century, so are not typically medieval. The presbytery is situated between the central crossing and the chancel, and were often used as a meeting place for church staff to congregate and discuss items of the day, with the rood screen providing some privacy from the public. The ambulatory is a sheltered passageway, commonly featured in cathedrals, which wraps around the high altar of the chancel. It acts as an additional aisle for people to navigate around the church, and was also an area often used to display rare relics and ornaments such as gilded crosses, garments or indeed bones of saints, and other treasures and trinkets. After the riot of Norwich in 1272 AD, many relics in Norwich Cathedral's ambulatory were damaged or stolen. So, in response to this, a new room in many cathedrals was built all across England, called the sacristy. This was a secured room reserved for the display and storage of sacred relics and treasures, often on the second floor of the cathedral, usually within the steeple tower. The construction of the ambulatory opened up the option to build additional chapels within the chancel, being extensions of the church. These chapels were often dedicated to specific saints, or sometimes reserved for women to use. Again, in cathedrals, priories and abbeys, cloisters were a common addition to the church's floor plan. These are one of the most famous additions, and often the main attraction to a cathedral in the modern day. Cloisters are large rectangular hallways which surrounds a central open square. This square is called the cloister garth, and was used as a place for rest and reflection, as well as a garden for the monks, where beautiful flowers such as roses could be grown. The cloister hallways were used by the monks as a place to walk while they pondered the great questions about life, death, and everything in between. The walls within the cloisters often featured recesses where books and scrolls were kept. Monks would read these as they walked through the hallways to learn about science, maths, history, and a variety of other subjects. Several doorways within the cloister walls would lead into various monastic buildings such as the chapter house, library, infirmary, and many more, but that is a subject for another day. I hope you've enjoyed this tour of the medieval church and how it evolved over time into the grand cathedrals that we see today. I haven't included everything, but I'm working on a series of videos discussing medieval priories, abbeys, friaries, and cathedrals, and what their purpose are in medieval society, so anything I haven't touched upon already may be included in those upcoming videos. If you haven't already, feel free to check out my video about medieval friaries. I've left a link in the video description below. And for now, thanks for watching.